So for lecture 17 review, there's quite a number of things that you have to be aware of that will show up on the quiz. So let's just kind of start from the beginning and kind of go from there. Let me give you the overview. There's going to be one question on speciation, and that has to do with what we call the 8 reproductive barriers. So if you remember all the way back at the beginning of this, when it showed you the different ways in which species can diverge from one another, be it ecological or habitat, temporal, behavioral, mechanical, gametic. Those are the prezygotic reproductive barriers, and I gave examples of those during the lecture. And then you have what we call the postzygotic. Most people get these confused because they all start with hybrid, so make sure that you pay close attention to the last part, the inviability or the infertility or the breakdown. Okay, that's the part where it will differ between those three. And again, the examples that we used in class. Basically, these will be the answers, and make sure that you read them carefully. They're going to describe either a temporal change in their fertility times, or incompatibility of the mating organs, or the first generation of hybrid. That's what we call hybrid sterility. The second generation of hybrid, that's the one that is the hybrids having infertile offspring, and that's what we call hybrid breakdown. So those are the only two, hybrid infertility and hybrid breakdown, that sometimes people get mixed up. Most of the others are pretty self-explanatory in how they differentiate between them. The second thing that you're going to have a question on is phylogenetics, and this one's primarily a definition one, but it comes down to understanding that we create the taxonomy, which is the classification of species, those branches of who belongs to what and what's their relationship with one another. We call that phylogenetics. Basically, we look at the DNA and the proteins. So that's what the genetics is the DNA. Biochemical, that's the proteins. And there were examples given of that, especially when it comes to things like developmental genes, like the ultrabithorax protein, or genes that are found in mitochondria, like the cytochrome C protein. That's pretty well conserved between species, and so we look at the differences between those. And that's what phylogenetics is. It's basically using DNA and protein differences to create this hierarchy of organism relationships to one another. The third question you're going to have is on the overall taxonomy itself, and that's this list that you see right here from domain all the way down to species. This picture illustrates kind of the dynamics. The higher up you go, the more species that you include within that. But as you go further and further down, it gets more and more restricted till you finally get to that final species. And so generally I'm going to test you on which of these has the most number of species included into it, and I'll choose 5 from this list. Or I'll say which has the least number of species included into it, and again I'll choose 5 from this list. So it's not really more complex than that. I just want you to be familiar with this list, that you understand that this is how we basically classify species based upon their evolutionary relatedness. This is phylogenetics and taxonomy. So phylogenetics is the study of that. Taxonomy is basically how we group them together, and that's what this is related to. Now, your other questions are primarily going to be on the 3 domains. All the remaining questions you're going to have on the exam, the 7 questions, are going to be on each of the domains and the kingdoms of those domains. So bacteria and archaea, those are only going to be tested on the domain. So fundamentally, it's going to test you on the differences between these 2 domains. Archaea are pretty simple. These are the extremophiles. As we talked about them, these are the ones that tend to live in the more extreme environments, like methane-producing environments, or high salt concentrations, or extremely hot and acidic environments. And we showed those 3 types of archaea. So the reason why they sometimes get confused with bacteria is because they're prokaryotic cells, just like bacteria. But more often than not, the questions are pretty simple. They're going to ask you which of the following is a type of archaea that lives in swamp-like areas and produces methane, or lives in extremely salty conditions. These are halophiles. Sometimes it'll say which of the following is not an example of an archaea, and you've got methanogens, halophiles, thermocytophiles. If I throw something in there like a cyanobacteria or a purple sulfur bacteria or chlamydia, Again, these are all bacteria. So these are examples of bacteria. Again, if it's not a methanogen, a halophile, or a thermocytophile, choose whatever is left, right? If that's the question you get. Now, the other questions on bacteria, primarily it's going to test you on some of the things that are unique to the bacteria domain. One of those in particular that I'm going to pay close attention to is the fact that bacteria, some of them are photosynthetic. Some of them use chlorophyll. Now, they don't have chloroplasts, but they do use chlorophyll, and they undergo photosynthesis. And we don't see Archaea having that ability to undergo photosynthesis. And so this is a big distinguishing characteristic between the two domains. And so this is one of those things that I tend to focus on. Okay. There's lots of different types of bacteria. I'm not going to test you on what each one generally does and what diseases they cause. But sometimes I'll test you on a couple of things because it's related to ecology, such as the fact that some bacteria can fix nitrogen and turn it into ammonia or nitrate, or that bacteria can survive extreme environments and go into this spore state. Okay, so they form these endospores. So I might test you on that concept that, what is it that bacteria can do to be able to survive harsh conditions, and that's the endospore. And some questions may just test you on the bacteria's ability to essentially take up DNA from its environment, which allows it to adapt and evolve very rapidly. And so these are just examples of how bacteria can share genetic information with one another, or get them virally, or even just pick them up from the environment itself. They're very good at doing that. So it could be on one of those concepts for the bacteria domain. Now, the eukarya domain has 4 kingdoms to it, and each one of those kingdoms is going to have its own question on the exam. As far as the protists go, just know the examples that we talked about in the lecture: algae, dinoflagellates, diatoms, and slime molds. Those are kind of the 4 main. The reason why I chose those is because they're good examples of photosynthetic organisms, or organisms that have to do with things like the red tide. Slime molds are good because it just shows that other kingdoms have decomposers in them that are very similar to other decomposers. They're not fungi, but we used to think that they were. And so generally the question on the exam will ask which of the following is not an example of a protist. And these are the 4 protist examples I use. So if it's something other than that, I usually throw in plants. So make sure you're looking for some type of plant that we've gone over and whatnot. That's pretty much the extent of this question. As far as fungi go, the question will pretty much look at the general characteristics of the fungi kingdom. So make sure you know that there are both unicellular and multicellular fungi, that the main body is made of mycelium and not the fruiting body, which is the mushroom, that they make a cell wall out of chitin, and that they can reproduce asexually and sexually, that they're only decomposers, and they are used in a number of different types of foods and medicines. So generally the question will say which of the following is not true regarding the fungi kingdom. And I may say that they make their cell wall out of cellulose. Well, that's plants. Or I may say that the main body of the fungi is the fruiting body. Well, that's not true. It's the mycelium. This is the filaments that live underneath the ground. Or that they only reproduce asexually and not sexually. So generally I'm going to pull from this list and say which of the following is not true of the fungi kingdom. So this is the one to pay close attention to for the exam. Plants are really easy in terms of their general questions. I'm going to test you on these 4 groups: the difference between bryophytes and the ferns, which we call seedless vascular plants, but it's the ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. Those are kind of the 4 main groups: bryophytes, ferns, gymnosperms, angiosperms. And essentially I'm going to describe what they are. Do they have vascular tissue? If they don't, it's bryophytes. Do they produce seed? Well, if they don't, then it's not a seedless or vascular plant like a fern or a bryophyte, then it's only gymnosperms or angiosperms. Do they produce flowers? Well, that's only angiosperms. So pay close attention to this diagram here, because it's going to describe one of the 4 groups, and you tell me which group I'm talking about. So those will be the answers for your quiz questions. Animals, typically it comes down to a couple of questions. It'll usually say which of the following is an example of an invertebrate, and I'll generally give you 4 vertebrates, which belong down here in the Chordata phylum, the fishes, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals. And then I'll throw in one of these examples that we talked about during the lecture. Or I may say which of the following is an example of a vertebrate, and I'll give you 4 examples from here, and I'll throw in a fish or an amphibian, reptile, bird, or mammal. Generally, you'll know if it's a fish, or I'll say frog, or I'll say snake, or monkey. So they're really well-known examples when it comes to the vertebrates. Invertebrates go from this list. This is generally where I pull from when I've been talking about the different types of invertebrates. Now, some questions may ask which phylum only has vertebrates. Well, the Chordata phylum is the only phylum that has vertebrates in it. All phylums have invertebrates in them, but the Chordata phylum is the only one that has vertebrates. This is basically, when you think of animals, this is generally what people think of. And this is why in this lecture, I make a distinction in the fact that most animals are not vertebrates. They're invertebrates. That's where the majority of the animal kingdom belongs. Now, the final question that you're going to have actually combines all of the characteristics of the kingdoms and domains that we've been talking about. And this is by far the most difficult question, because I'm going to describe either the bacteria domain, the Archaea domain, or one of the 4 kingdoms of the Eukarya domain, and you need to tell me which kingdom or domain I'm describing. Now, to do that, I need to basically pull up the board here, and let's kind of go through a few things to help you understand exactly what I'm going at here. So if we write down all of the kingdoms and domain from bacteria, Archaea, Protists, animal, plant, and fungi, and you want to look at what are the general characteristics. Let's look first on how they're organized, okay? So their level of organization fundamentally comes down to whether they are single-celled or multicellular. Now, the reason why I do this is because this starts summing things up that we've been talking about all semester regarding their level of organization, how they use energy, basically their ecological role and how they use energy, how they reproduce, right? So their reproduction, basically the characteristics of life. This is why I do it the way that I do it, because we're summing things up in this way. So, for example, for bacteria, these are all single-celled organisms. There are no multicellular organisms. They're all single-celled. Same thing for Archaea. But when you get to the Protist kingdom, you have both single-celled and you have multicellular organisms, because some protists, like algae, are single-celled. Some other protists are multicellular. Animals, there are no single-celled organisms. They're all multicellular. Same thing for plant. There are no single-celled plants. But fungi, you have both single-celled, which are things like yeast, and then most of them are multicellular. So this is just a way of describing their level of organization on a cellular level. Ecologically, we look at what role they play. Are they an autotroph, meaning do they make their own food? Or are they a decomposer, meaning they break down the waste and the dead? Or are they a consumer? So let's look at bacteria. Remember that their main job is decomposition. They break things down. But you do have some bacteria that are autotrophs, and so they do undergo some photosynthesis. Archaea, their main job is decomposition. There's nothing else that they really do. Protists, one of their main jobs is being an autotroph. That's their role in the ecosystem. They are producers that generate energy. But of course, you also have decomposers in that group. Slime molds is one of the examples we talked about. Now, the animal kingdom is pretty simple. We have consumers and decomposers. Basically, we're the only kind of group in the ecosystem that is considered consumers. All the others are either autotrophs or decomposers. But we do have decomposers in the animal kingdom as well that you have to be aware of. Plants, their only role is to make food. They are autotrophs. There's no decomposers in there. There's no consumers in there. That is their kingdom. And fungi, their job is decomposition. That's their job. Reproduction, whether they reproduce sexually or asexually. Now, if you're a single-celled organism like bacteria, your only mode of reproduction is asexual reproduction. Archaea, same thing. They're single-celled organisms. Protists, on the other hand, do both. They have both asexual and sexual reproduction in their kingdom. Same thing for the plant kingdom. You got asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. And same thing for the fungi kingdom. You've got mitosis, which is asexual reproduction, and you also have the formation of haploid and recombinant spores that will undergo sexual reproduction. Animal kingdom, they're mainly sexually reproducing species. So if I say that organisms within this kingdom only reproduce sexually, then you already know I'm talking about the animal kingdom. That's one of the distinguishing characteristics of this kingdom. Now, beyond this, I usually throw in a couple of extra things for the kingdom or domain. Like if I say that they make their cell wall out of cellulose, then you know I'm talking about the plant kingdom. If I say they make their cell wall out of chitin, you know I'm talking about the fungi kingdom. Bacteria, that's peptidoglycan. That's the crazy one we were talking about before. So I'll usually throw in some extra things, right? Animals are mobile. They have the ability to move around because of muscle tissue. So do bacteria. There are a lot of bacteria that have flagellum that allow them to be mobile and move around. Other species aren't necessarily mobile. Plant, fungi, and things of that sort. Archaea, they're not really mobile. Protists, it just depends. Some of them have flagellum and they're able to move. So beyond these three, what I'll essentially do is give you the general characteristics, and then from that, you'll say, oh, that's a plant. Again, these are used as a kind of a hard determination between the kingdoms and domains. So if I say they're only multicellular, you've already restricted it down to two kingdoms. You already know it's one of these two kingdoms, and then you can generally get the gist from the rest of it. If they're only single-celled organisms, again, you've already narrowed it down to these two right here. And so I'll give you a wide variety of characteristics. You tell me which kingdom or domain I'm talking about, and these essentially will be the answers here that you'll pull from. So that's one of the most difficult questions on the exam. This is also one of the ways in which the questions are going to be phrased on the final exam. And so we're going to come back to this because this is essentially how I'm going to test you on the final exam for all of the kingdoms and domains. In fact, you've got two questions on all of this on the final exam, very similar to how we just went over them, because I feel it's that important to sum it up in this manner, because we're at the very end of the semester here and we're bringing it all together. So hopefully that helps you to get ready for lecture 17 and prepare for those quiz questions.